Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the relationship between philosophy and science. In our culture, philosophy generally is perceived as useless and a waste of time. There are countless jokes about the futility of philosophy. I am, unfortunately, well acquainted with many of these jokes. For example, consider this one, the light bulb joke. How many philosophers does it take to change a light bulb? One philosopher says, it depends on what you mean by change. Well, there's an interesting question. Define light bulb. That's a clever philosopher trick. How can you be sure it needs changing? The answer is 3. It takes 3 philosophers to change a light bulb. 1 to change it and 2 to stand around arguing over whether or not the light bulb exists. Okay, so here's another such joke that cuts a little too close to the bone for me. What is a recent philosophy PhD's most frequently asked question in their first job? Would you like French fries with that? Right. As a recent philosophy PhD myself, I assure you I've heard numerous versions of that particular joke. So there are many more jokes to this effect, poking fun at the futility of philosophy. In addition to this cultural tendency to poke fun at philosophy, some folks harbor a more hostile attitude toward philosophy and philosophers. Now, hostility and resentment is nothing new for philosophy, of course. Socrates, after all, was sentenced to death and executed simply for challenging authority. Philosophers have been annoying people for millennia. However, the contemporary hostility toward philosophy is most distressing when it comes from other academics, other scholars in pursuit of knowledge. Recently, several prominent scientists have publicly expressed disdain for philosophy. For example, Stephen Hawking has recently declared several times that philosophy is dead. The ever-provocative Richard Dawkins has asserted that philosophers are arrogant and ignorant poachers of ideas. So here's what he says about this in a Behavioral and Brain Sciences article. An unkind definition of a certain type of philosopher is someone who doesn't have a subject of his own, but thinks he can do other people's subjects better than they can. My own subject of evolutionary ethology is particularly vulnerable, since we tend to write in plainer English than, say, nuclear physicist or immunologist, and any philosopher can quickly pick up enough smatterings to sound important. He does not paint a particularly rosy picture of his academic colleagues. Similarly, a couple of years ago, an ugly kerfuffle broke out between David Albert, a philosopher at Columbia University who also has a PhD in physics, and Lawrence Krauss, who's a physicist at Arizona State University. So this dispute played out in the pages of the New York Times, Scientific American, and The Atlantic. Albert, the philosopher, accused Krauss, the physicist, of making some very basic logical errors in his recent book, A Universe from Nothing. Krauss, in response, accused Albert and other philosophers, other moronic philosophers, of being insecure about their dying, irrelevant discipline. Right. So the result was a lot of name-calling and troop rallying, and the turf wars that resulted only solidified the divisions between philosophers and scientists. My view, what I'm going to try to argue in my comments here, is that these divisions are unnecessary and in the end counterproductive to the pursuit of knowledge. While I reject, indeed strenuously reject, the idea that a pursuit must be useful to be worthwhile, in my comments here, I'm going to focus on the usefulness of philosophy. I'm going to argue that philosophy is useful for science. Moreover, stronger, this interaction between philosophy of science is both necessary and mutually beneficial for philosophers and scientists. Okay, so why do I think that? Well, often philosophers and scientists are asking the same sorts of questions. They're asking questions about human nature, about the universe, about our role in the universe. Though scientists and philosophers are asking the same sorts of questions, they bring to bear different resources for answering these questions. Slide 2. Okay, so philosophers are trained in conceptual clarity, in understanding how the pieces of a puzzle fit together, and answering big picture questions such as what exists, what can we know, and what is valuable. Using rigorous conceptual analysis, we try to figure out the best way to understand a phenomenon and what implications this has for the way that we conceptualize the world. So Wilfrid Sellars offers a general description of what philosophers do. It's vague, but I think it accurately captures what we're trying to do. Here's what he says. The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. That's generally what philosophers are trying to do. In contrast, scientists bring a different set of skills to the table. Scientists are trained in experimental design and data gathering and mathematical analysis of data. They focus on testing precise empirical claims. Moreover, scientists' familiarity with the existing empirical evidence puts them in a better position to judge what we know and do not know about the empirical world. So given that philosophers and scientists often are asking the same sorts of questions, but bring to bear different resources for answering these questions, it stands to reason that combining forces can be mutually beneficial. So, on the one hand, philosophers can help clarify foundational issues in the sciences. Scientific theories often involve theory-laden concepts, and careful conceptual analysis of these concepts makes a difference to the interpretation of the empirical evidence. Moreover, scientists often do make philosophical claims in their research, despite their protests to the contrary. They may not recognize these claims as philosophical. They may regard these claims simply as common sense, when in fact they're simply taking for granted a particular philosophical framework. For example, some neuroscientists argue that free will is an illusion. They cite data showing that significantly before we're consciously aware of our decisions, there are detectable patterns of neural activity which are correlated with our decisions, suggesting that our brains have decided before we are even consciously aware of the decision. The neuroscientific arguments that free will is an illusion presuppose a particular philosophical account of free will. Whether or not the data show that free will is an illusion depends on which conception of free will one adopts. And here, the philosophical considerations are crucial. Similarly, research on the evolution of morality presupposes a philosophical account of what morality is and which moral theory is correct. Simply presupposing a supposed common sense view about free will or morality obscures an underlying complexity. I take it that one of the most intellectually difficult aspects of doing science well is recognizing the assumptions implicit in one's research and, if necessary, challenging those assumptions. But this is exactly what philosophers are trained to do. This is what we do every day. Furthermore, philosophers have the luxury of focusing on big picture issues, unlike scientists who are not rewarded for coming up with grand theories. The social structure of science rewards a narrow focus. The incentive for scientists is to come up with clever experiments that yield surprising results. We philosophers are not subject to the same social structure, the same social constraints as scientists. Thus, we are well positioned to situate scientific theories and evidence in terms of big picture questions about human nature, the universe, and our role in it. On the flip side, scientific results can have interesting and important implications for traditional philosophical issues. This point bears emphasis because I think philosophers often do not pay nearly enough attention to what's happening in science. Just as scientists often make philosophical claims, philosophers often make empirical claims. Attention to the empirical literature may show that not only are some of these empirical claims testable, but in fact have been tested. Scientific results may show that some philosophical theories are simply not supported by the empirical literature, whereas others are. Understanding the relevant science may reveal that some philosophical questions are flawed because they're premised on a misunderstanding of how some phenomenon works. So careful attention to the empirical literature will help philosophers in their pursuit of knowledge. Thus, philosophy stands to benefit from combining forces as well. Okay. So my comments thus far have been fairly general. I'd like to make them more specific by using as an example my own area of research, which is highly interdisciplinary. My area of research is philosophy of cognitive science. So I focus mostly on social cognition, which very basically is our ability to understand and interact with other people. And all sorts of ordinary circumstances every day, we understand and interact with other people, driving on a busy freeway, engaging in a debate, following politics, gossiping, playing sports. These are examples of social cognition. The goal of my research is to understand how social cognition works, what happens when it breaks down, and most importantly, the cognitive architecture that makes our social cognition possible. Theories about social cognition are shaped by philosophical considerations, empirical evidence, including developmental psychology studies and cognitive neuroscience. So here's an example of an interaction between philosophers and scientists, developmental psychologists specifically. In developmental psychology, new advances in experimental design have yielded clever experiments and surprising results. These findings suggest that infants as young as 7 months old are capable of tracking others' beliefs and preferences and intentions. This is really surprising. We did not expect this. Philosophers and developmental psychologists did not expect this. Now, a debate is currently afoot in philosophy and psychology about how to interpret these experimental results. On the one hand, one could argue that these results show that by 7 months old, infants are already interpreting others' behavior in terms of beliefs. That is, they already have the concept of belief. On this view, infants' understanding of others is not fundamentally different than adults' understanding of others. They don't have the experience that adults have, of course, and they don't have language capacities, but it's not fundamentally different. So that's one interpretation of the data. A second interpretation of the data is that the concept of belief is far too sophisticated for infants, especially 7-month-old infants, to grasp. So what this suggests is that these studies show that infants are merely very clever behavior readers, and thus their way of understanding other people is fundamentally, radically different from adults' way of understanding other people. The considerations in this debate about infant social cognition span philosophy and psychology. Importantly, philosophers and psychologists not only are engaged in each other's research, that is, sort of citing philosophers' work and psychologists' work, but they're also collaborating with each other. Philosophers and scientists are writing papers together, they're running experiments together, and the result is, in my view, mutually beneficial. I think that we have, as a result, a better and deeper understanding of social cognition. So social cognition is just one area of research that is benefiting scientists. There are numerous other areas where this interaction is or would be advantageous. Consider the following areas. So what counts as a mental health disorder? What sorts of illnesses should we require insurance companies to cover? What diseases are top public health priorities? How do we balance the risks and uncertainties and potential social impacts of climate change policies, especially and most pressingly geoengineering projects? How should we address ethical problems affecting scientific research? For example, conflict of interest, academic misconduct, failure to replicate studies. To this end, the NSF and the NIH have recently started requiring research ethics as a requirement for all their grant recipients. Hey there. Does science explain away morality? Does it show that there's nothing really to morality, that it's just an evolved capacity like any other evolved capacity? Can we experiment on animals in any which way we want if it's for the greater good of humanity? And if not, what are the ethical limits? How does the language we speak influence our thought process, influence the kind of thought we're capable of? Does neuroscience show that free will is an illusion? How does our evolving understanding of how memory works affect our conception of the self? And finally, the million-dollar question, consciousness. Can neuroscience ever solve the hard problem of consciousness, which is, why do we have conscious experiences at all? Investigating these issues should involve both philosophers and scientists, as each group brings to the table a different way of thinking about the issues. The kind of interdisciplinary action is both mutually beneficial and necessary for a fuller and deeper understanding of the topics. All scholars are in pursuit of knowledge. We should not let disciplinary boundaries shackle this pursuit of knowledge. Now, my claim here is not revolutionary. In the crowd that I run with, everybody thinks that this is just obviously true. I don't think it is obviously true, but everybody thinks it's obviously true. Moreover, in a series of letters in the 1940s, Albert Einstein recognized this. And this is a series of a correspondence between Albert Einstein and Robert Thornton in 1944. He says, "So many people today, and even professional scientists, seem to me like somebody who has seen thousands of trees but has never seen a forest. A knowledge of the historic and philosophical background gives that kind of independence from prejudices of his generation from which most scientists are suffering. This independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth." Okay, thank you.